The sound of champagne glasses clinking still echoed in my ears when my world shattered. It was supposed to be the most beautiful night of my life, a charity gala celebrating my husband's latest business award. I had spent weeks preparing for it, carefully picking a dress that hid my growing baby bump just enough to surprise him with the news later that night. The ballroom glowed under the golden lights. People smiled, shook hands, exchanged polite laughter. I remember standing near the stage, my hand resting on my stomach, feeling the soft flutter of life inside me. Then I saw it, felt it, before my eyes could even confirm. Across the room, my husband Daniel stood with his hand on another woman's back, guiding her closer to him. Her red dress clung to her body like it was painted on. I told myself it was nothing. A business partner, maybe. But then he leaned down, whispered into her ear, and she laughed. A kind of laugh I hadn't heard from him in months. And then, he kissed her. Not a friendly peck, a kiss that stole the air from my lungs and made my knees buckle. The room didn't stop spinning even when I grabbed the back of a chair for balance. People saw it. I know they did, because conversations slowed, glances darted toward me, and someone in the corner covered her mouth. My cheeks burned, not from embarrassment alone, but from the realization that this was real. I wanted to scream, to march across the floor and demand answers, but my body froze. My mind kept replaying the past weeks. Him coming home late, smelling faintly of perfume, dismissing my questions with a tired smile. I had wanted so badly to believe him. A voice broke through my thoughts. "Mrs. Collins? Are you all right?" It was Julia, my neighbor and the only friend I'd made since moving to the city. Her eyes darted between me and Daniel, who was still holding the woman close. My throat felt like sandpaper. I think I need some air," I whispered. I left before I could see more. My heels clicked against the marble, faster and faster, until I reached the cool night air outside. My hands were trembling so badly, I could barely open my purse. A black town car pulled up. The driver stepped out. "Mrs. Collins, will Mr. Collins be joining you?" "No," I said, my voice breaking on that single word. "Take me home." The ride back was silent, except for the sound of my shallow breathing. I pressed my hand against my stomach, as if shielding the baby from the pain tearing through me. When I walked into our penthouse, the city lights stretching out beneath me felt like a cruel reminder of how small I was in Daniel's world. I wanted to believe this was a mistake, that there was some explanation. But deep down, I already knew the truth. And yet, I also knew I couldn't confront him tonight. Not here, not with the baby, not while the betrayal was still fresh and bleeding. So I waited. And the waiting turned into something far darker. Because what I would soon uncover about Daniel's secret life was far worse than just an affair. I didn't sleep that night. Every sound from the hallway, every hum of the elevator made my heart race, thinking it might be him coming home. But Daniel didn't come back. I sat on the couch in the dark, my dress still wrinkled from the gala, makeup smeared on my cheeks. I kept replaying the scene in my head, him leaning in, her laugh, the way he looked at her. It wasn't just attraction. It was familiarity, comfort. This wasn't the first time. At around 4 a.m., I finally heard the click of the front door. He walked in like nothing had happened, loosening his tie, his cologne mixing with a faint scent of someone else's perfume. "You're still up?" he asked casually, as if he hadn't just shattered our marriage in front of dozens of people. "I saw you," I said quietly. His hands froze mid-motion. "Saw me? What?" "At the gala, with her." A flicker of something, guilt maybe, crossed his face, but it vanished quickly. He sighed, walking toward the bedroom. "You're overreacting, Claire. She's a colleague. We were celebrating, that's all." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to pretend my eyes had lied to me. But then my phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. It was a photo. Daniel and the woman taken from behind a pillar at the gala. His hand was on her waist. They were kissing. The caption, "You deserve to know the truth." My blood ran cold. "Colleague?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Then why am I getting photos from strangers?" Daniel turned to look at me, his jaw tightening. "Delete it. Don't start drama. It's not good for the baby." And just like that, he tried to make me the problem. Something inside me snapped. This wasn't just about betrayal anymore. It was about control, how he always dismissed my feelings, how he made me doubt my own eyes and instincts. I realized that if I stayed, I'd lose more than my marriage. I'd lose myself. The next morning, before he woke up, I packed a small suitcase. Just enough clothes for a few days. My plan was simple: leave the city, clear my head, figure out what to do next. I booked a one-way ticket to the smallest, quietest place I could find on the map, a remote coastal town I'd never even heard of before. When I stepped off the bus hours later, the air was salty and fresh, the streets lined with old brick buildings and faded signs. It felt like stepping into another world, slower, quieter, almost untouched by time. For the first time in months, I could breathe. I thought I'd come here to heal, to hide, to start over. But I was wrong, because in this quiet little town, I was about to discover something that would turn my life upside down all over again. And this time, it wouldn't be Daniel holding the knife. My name is Claire Collins. I'm 34 years old, and until a week ago, I thought I knew exactly who I was: a devoted wife, soon-to-be mother, and the quiet half of a picture-perfect marriage. I grew up in a small, working-class neighborhood outside Chicago. My parents owned a tiny bakery, the kind where customers were treated like family, and flour always seemed to dust the air. I was the oldest of three, the one who was supposed to set a good example, the one who never caused trouble. After college, I moved to the city to work as an assistant in a publishing company. That's where I met Daniel. He wasn't my boss, but he might as well have been. He walked into every room like he owned it. Tall, well-dressed, with a smile that could disarm anyone, he had the kind of confidence that made you feel like you were the only person in the world when he looked at you. We started dating quickly. Within a year, he'd proposed in front of the fountain at Millennium Park. My parents cried. I thought it was because they were happy for me, but now I wonder if they saw something in him I didn't. When Daniel's career took off, he wanted me to quit my job. "Why work yourself to exhaustion when I can provide for us?" he'd say. And at first it felt like a gift. More time at home, more time for the life we were building. But slowly, without realizing it, my days stopped belonging to me. My life revolved around his schedule, his needs, his social events, and yet I didn't complain. That's not what you do when you love someone. You make sacrifices, you keep the peace. At least, that's what I told myself. When I found out I was pregnant, I felt like maybe everything was falling into place again. Daniel had been distant lately, but I thought the news might bring us closer. I imagined telling him at the gala, imagined the joy on his face. Instead, I got the image of him kissing another woman burned into my memory. Now, here I am in a remote coastal town, with a suitcase, a growing belly, and a head full of questions I'm not sure I want answered. The locals have been polite but cautious. The woman at the diner where I had breakfast told me most outsiders don't stay long. She didn't mean it as a threat. It was just a fact. People here know each other's histories, and strangers are met with curiosity that can quickly turn into suspicion. I've rented a small room above a bookstore owned by an older man named Henry. He barely speaks, but when he does, his voice is rough like gravel. There's something about the way he studies me, like he's trying to figure out what I'm running from. And he's not wrong. I came here to escape my marriage, but already I can feel that the past has a way of catching up. And soon, I'll learn that in this quiet little town, I'm not the only one hiding from something. The first few days in town passed in a blur. I tried to keep to myself. Early walks along the harbor, quiet lunches at the diner, evenings reading in my small rented room. But keeping to yourself in a place like this is harder than it sounds. People notice you. On my second morning, a woman knocked on my door. She introduced herself as Margaret, the bookstore's part-time clerk. She was in her late 50s, with sharp eyes that missed nothing, and a way of speaking that made you feel like she'd known you your whole life. "You're the new tenant," she said, handing me a cup of coffee without asking if I wanted one. "Henry doesn't rent his upstairs room to just anyone." I smiled politely, unsure how to respond. "I guess I'm lucky then." Margaret studied me for a moment. "People come here for two reasons. They're running toward something, or they're running away from something. Which are you?" I laughed softly, but there was no humor in it. "Maybe both." She didn't push for more, but I could tell she'd already filed me away as someone to watch. The truth was, I didn't know how much of my old life I should share. Back in the city, everyone knew me as Daniel's wife. That title had been both a comfort and a cage. Here, I could be anyone. I could say I was a freelance writer or a consultant or even unemployed, and no one would know the difference. But lying came with its own weight. I spent my afternoons wandering the narrow streets, getting to know the rhythm of the town. Fishermen mended their nets on the dock. Children raced their bikes down the slope toward the lighthouse. And everywhere I went, I felt eyes on me. Not in a hostile way, but with the quiet curiosity reserved for newcomers in a place where everyone else has known each other since birth. One evening, Henry finally spoke more than a sentence to me. I was sitting in the shop, flipping through a stack of old journals he'd left on the counter. "You're not here for a vacation," he said, without looking up from the book he was cataloging. It wasn't a question, but I answered anyway. "No." "Good," he replied. "Vacations don't last. But if you're here to stay, you'll need to understand this place. We take care of our own. Outsiders can find that difficult." Something in his tone made me think he wasn't warning me out of malice, but out of experience. Maybe he'd seen others come and go. Maybe he knew what it was to run. I went to bed that night thinking about his words. I didn't know yet if I was staying, but for the first time I realized that if I did, I'd have to build a new version of myself, one that wasn't defined by Daniel's shadow. And just when I began to think I could disappear here quietly, someone from my old life found me. The town of Greyhaven looked like it had been frozen in time. It was the kind of place you might see on a postcard: cobblestone streets, weathered brick buildings, and a harbor lined with fishing boats that had probably been passed down for generations. From my room above the bookstore, I could see the lighthouse standing tall at the edge of the cliffs, its beams sweeping across the water every few seconds. At night, when the waves crashed against the rocks below, the sound was both haunting and comforting, like a reminder that the world kept moving no matter how broken you felt. The center of town was a small square with a fountain that no longer worked. Around it stood the essentials: the diner, a post office, a hardware store, and a small grocery with a faded open sign that flickered when the wind picked up. There was no supermarket, no movie theater, and certainly no luxury boutiques like the ones Daniel and I used to visit. Life here moved at a different pace, slower and more deliberate. The bookstore where I was staying was one of the oldest buildings in Greyhaven. The wooden floors creaked underfoot, and the air smelled faintly of salt and old paper. Henry kept the front windows spotless, but inside, the shelves leaned with the weight of decades-old books. Some were so worn, their titles had faded from the spines. Behind the shop, a narrow alley led to the harbor. It was where the fishermen unloaded their catch in the early mornings. I would sometimes sit on the back steps with a cup of tea, watching them work. They hardly spoke, but their movements were practiced, efficient, ropes coiled neatly, nets shaken out, crates stacked. It was a kind of quiet discipline I had never seen in the city. Even though Greyhaven was small, it was full of unspoken rules. You didn't ask too many questions. You learned who to greet on the street and who preferred to be left alone. You respected the ocean, because here it was both a provider and a taker. Margaret explained it best one afternoon while we stocked shelves. The town survives because people look out for each other. But that also means we notice when someone's different, and when we notice, we talk. Her words stayed with me. I had come here to be invisible, but invisibility was impossible in a place like this. Every time I walked into the diner, conversations paused just long enough to let me know I'd been acknowledged. Every time I bought groceries, the cashier asked where I was from, though the tone was polite, not intrusive. And yet, despite the stares and the whispers, I began to feel a strange sense of safety here. No one knew my history, and for now, that was enough. But safety in Greyhaven was fragile, because just when I started to think I could blend in, I saw a familiar car parked near the harbor, one that had no reason to be here. And I knew, without a doubt, that whoever was inside wasn't here by accident. The car was black, sleek, and out of place among the battered pickup trucks and weather-worn sedans that filled the harbor lot. I stood frozen on the bookstore's back steps, my mug of tea cooling in my hands. I couldn't see the driver through the tinted windows, but my heart pounded all the same. I told myself it could be anyone. A tourist, a lost traveler, someone visiting family. But deep down, I knew better, because the only other place I'd ever seen that car was parked outside Daniel's office building in the city. I decided not to walk toward it. Instead, I slipped inside the shop, closed the back door quietly, and peeked through the dusty blinds. The car didn't move for nearly half an hour. Then, as if sensing my gaze, the engine started, and it rolled away slowly, disappearing up the hill. For the rest of the day, I couldn't shake the unease. The town's calm, steady rhythm suddenly felt like a fragile shell that could crack at any moment. That evening, Margaret found me sitting at one of the bookstore tables, staring at a blank notebook page. "You've got that look," she said. "What look?" I asked. "The look of someone who's wondering if they made a mistake coming here." I almost told her about the car, but I stopped myself. I didn't want to drag her, or anyone, into whatever might follow me from the city. "Just tired," I said instead. She didn't push, but her eyes lingered on me for a moment too long before she went back to sorting books. Over the next few days, I tried to focus on settling in. I learned the best time to visit the grocery store. Early morning, before the fishermen's wives filled the aisles, and the quietest path along the cliffs, a dirt trail just past the lighthouse. I even started helping Henry in the shop, dusting shelves, logging inventory, and ringing up the occasional customer. Henry wasn't one for conversation, but one afternoon, as we worked in silence, he said, "If you stay here long enough, the ocean will tell you who belongs and who doesn't." I glanced at him. "And what if I don't belong?" He gave a slight shrug. "Then you'll know it before anyone tells you." I thought about that all night. Belonging was something I hadn't felt in years, not even in my own marriage. But here in Greyhaven, maybe there was a chance to build it from scratch. The sound of waves against the rocks lulled me to sleep. For a few hours, I forgot about the black car, the betrayal, and the life I'd left behind. But the next morning, a small envelope was slipped under my door. No name, no return address, just a single sheet of paper inside, with 7 words written in neat, block letters. "He knows where you are. Leave now." Daniel Collins had always been a man people noticed. In the city, his name carried weight. He was the CEO of a growing real estate empire, the kind of man who could turn an abandoned building into a gold mine. On the surface, he was charming, generous, and driven, but I had learned too late that charm can be a weapon when wielded by the wrong person. When I first met him, I thought his ambition was admirable. He worked long hours, took big risks, and surrounded himself with people who seemed to worship him. But over time, I began to see cracks in the mask. He didn't just want success, he wanted control. Every conversation had an angle. Every gift came with strings attached. The woman I saw him with at the gala, her name was Vanessa, wasn't just a colleague, as he claimed. She was a public relations consultant who had been working closely with him for months. I'd met her once at a company holiday party. She'd been all smiles and warm handshakes, but even then I'd felt a strange tension in the air between her and Daniel. Daniel knew how to manipulate people into doubting themselves. When I caught him in lies, he'd twist the story until I was questioning my own memory. "You're tired, Claire," he'd say. "You're stressed. You're reading too much into things." And because I wanted to keep the peace, I let him. But his betrayal at the gala wasn't just about infidelity, it was about humiliation. He didn't care that people saw. In fact, I think part of him wanted me to see, to remind me of my place. Daniel didn't believe in equals. He believed in winning. And in his mind, marriage was just another arena where he needed to dominate. The problem was, Daniel wasn't the kind of man to let go easily. Divorce wasn't just a personal matter to him, it was a threat to his image. And when his image was threatened, he fought back, quietly, strategically, and without mercy. I could imagine him now, back in the city, pacing his office, furious that I had slipped away without giving him the chance to spin the story in his favor. That black car by the harbor, I was starting to believe it had been his doing. Maybe he hadn't been inside, but someone he trusted had. What Daniel didn't know, or maybe didn't care to remember, was that I wasn't the naive girl he'd married. Yes, I was scared. Yes, I was pregnant. But fear can be a powerful teacher. And somewhere deep down, I knew that if he had tracked me to Greyhaven, he wasn't here to win me back. He was here to make sure I couldn't tell anyone what I knew about him, and what I had the power to prove. The truth was, I knew things about Daniel that could ruin him. I hadn't gone looking for them. They'd fallen into my lap over the years, scraps of overheard conversations, misplaced documents, strange meetings he brushed off as business. Once, I'd found a folder in his home office labeled Project Shoreline. It was full of contracts and offshore bank statements tied to properties that didn't exist on any official record. When I'd asked him about it, he'd laughed and said, "You wouldn't understand, Claire. It's complicated." But I did understand. It was fraud. I hadn't told anyone, not even my parents. Back then, I was still convinced I could keep my marriage together, that protecting Daniel's secrets meant protecting my future. But now I realized that those secrets were the reason he couldn't let me go. Vanessa, the woman from the gala, wasn't just an affair. She was a partner in more ways than one. I'd overheard enough of their late-night phone calls to know she was involved in his deals, smoothing over public perception while he handled the numbers. Together, they were untouchable. Unless someone on the inside spoke up. And that someone was me. That's why the note under my door didn't feel like a warning from a friend, it felt like a threat from him. A way to remind me that even in Greyhaven, I wasn't beyond his reach. The idea of facing him again made my skin crawl. Daniel had never hit me, never raised his voice in public, but behind closed doors, his anger was sharp and deliberate. He didn't need to shout. He could cut you down with a look, a word, a carefully chosen sentence that made you feel small. I remembered the last fight we'd had before the gala. He'd come home late, smelling like whiskey and something floral. I'd asked where he'd been, and he'd stared at me for a long time before saying, "You should be more careful, Claire. About the way you talk to me, about what you think you know." Back then, I'd brushed it off as arrogance. Now, I saw it for what it was, a warning. The black car hadn't returned since that first day, but the note was enough to keep me looking over my shoulder. I started memorizing faces at the diner, watching for unfamiliar ones. I avoided walking alone at night. But Greyhaven wasn't just watching me, they were starting to close ranks around me. Margaret lingered in the shop more often. Henry asked more questions than before. Even the cashier at the grocery store gave me a quiet nod, like she knew something I didn't. It should have made me feel safer. Instead, it made me wonder if the danger wasn't just coming from Daniel, but from someone right here in Greyhaven who had their own reasons for wanting me gone. It happened on a Saturday morning when the town square was at its busiest. The farmers' market had taken over the cobblestone streets, stalls piled high with fresh bread, jars of honey, and baskets of bright vegetables. I'd been trying to enjoy the morning, telling myself that blending into the crowd might help me feel less like an outsider. I was at a stand picking out apples when I heard my name. Claire Collins. The voice was deep, steady, and far too familiar. My hand froze mid-reach. I turned, and there he was, Daniel, standing in the middle of Greyhaven like he belonged there. He wore a tailored coat that made him look even more out of place among the worn flannels and fishermen's sweaters. Every sound in the square seemed to fade. People stopped what they were doing. Conversations died mid-sentence. Daniel had that effect. His presence pulled attention whether you wanted it or not. "I've been looking for you," he said, loud enough for the nearby shoppers to hear. My stomach twisted. "You shouldn't be here." He smiled, but it was the kind of smile that carried a warning. "We need to talk. Alone." I shook my head. "There's nothing to talk about." He stepped closer, lowering his voice just enough for only me to hear. "You're making a scene, Claire, and you don't want these people to know who you really are." That was his move, flipping the narrative, making me feel like I was the problem. But the truth was, his very presence was the scene. People were staring, whispering. Margaret had appeared from somewhere, her eyes sharp, scanning Daniel like she was measuring him. "Go home, Daniel," I said louder this time. "You're not welcome here." The words surprised even me. My voice didn't shake. For a moment I thought I saw something flicker in his eyes, frustration, maybe even anger, but it vanished as quickly as it came. "Think about what you're doing," he said, straightening his coat. "You can't hide forever." With that, he turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing against the stones. The market slowly came back to life, but the air had changed. I could feel the weight of the stairs, the curiosity buzzing around me. Greyhaven wasn't a place where confrontations went unnoticed. Margaret came to my side. Do you want to tell me what that was about? I swallowed hard. Not here. We walked back to the bookstore together, my mind racing. Daniel had found me, and he hadn't cared who saw it. That wasn't a warning, it was a message. And if he was willing to confront me in public, I knew it was only a matter of time before he took things further. But what I didn't expect was that the next public humiliation wouldn't come from Daniel. It would come from someone I thought I could trust. 3 days after Daniel's appearance at the market, I was still rattled. I'd been keeping to the bookstore, avoiding crowded places. Margaret had been checking in on me more than usual, bringing tea and trying to draw me into conversation. I appreciated it, but I wasn't ready to talk. On Wednesday afternoon, she convinced me to join her for lunch at the diner. You can't hide forever, she'd said, echoing Daniel's words without realizing it. The diner was busier than usual, fishermen and shopkeepers filling the booths. I slid into a seat by the window, keeping my eyes down as Margaret ordered for both of us. I was just starting to relax when I heard the bell above the door. Vanessa walked in. For a second, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. But no, there she was, in a fitted coat, her red lipstick the same shade she'd worn at the gala. She scanned the room until her eyes landed on me. A smile spread across her face. Not a friendly one. She walked straight to our table. Claire, what a surprise. Her voice carried just enough for nearby tables to hear. Margaret looked between us. Friend of yours? I forced myself to stay calm. What are you doing here, Vanessa? Oh, I'm just visiting an old friend, she said, sliding a glance toward me. Daniel sends his regards. He's very worried about you. He thinks maybe you're not well. The words hit like a slap. I could feel every ear in the diner tuning in. That was the point. She wanted to plant the seed, to make me look unstable in front of the people I'd started to build trust with. I'm fine, I said, my voice steady. Vanessa leaned closer, her smile never fading. Then maybe you should come back and prove it, before you do something you regret. She straightened, turned to leave, and then, as if on impulse, said loudly, It's such a shame, really. She always seemed so put together before the incident. She didn't explain what incident meant, and she didn't need to. Whispers rippled through the diner as she walked out. Margaret's eyes were sharp on me. What was that about? I swallowed. Daniel's friend. She's trying to get to me. But I could tell from Margaret's expression that some doubt had slipped in. That was the danger of public humiliation. It didn't have to be true to leave a stain. When we left the diner, I could feel eyes following me all the way back to the bookstore. In the space of a few minutes, Vanessa had done more damage to my standing in Greyhaven than Daniel had. I went upstairs, closed my door, and sat on the bed. If they were willing to show up here together, even separately, it meant they were confident I had nowhere to turn. But they had underestimated me, because I wasn't as alone as they thought. That night, I sat on the edge of my bed, hugging my knees. The air felt heavier than usual, the silence too loud. Daniel's confrontation at the market and Vanessa's cruel performance at the diner kept looping in my head. I told myself I'd come here to escape them, but Greyhaven no longer felt like a refuge. It felt like a net tightening around me. I tried to sleep, but every sound in the building made me flinch. Around midnight, a soft thud came from the hallway. Then, a shadow moved past the crack under my door. My breath caught. The figure paused, then kept walking. In the morning, I found a single white lily lying on my doormat. No note, just the flower. My wedding flower. I clenched it in my fist until the petals crushed. Whoever had left it wanted me rattled. It worked, but only for a moment. By noon, I was downstairs pacing the bookstore. Henry watched me from behind the counter. You're not yourself, he said. I almost told him everything, but stopped. If I pulled him into this, he'd be in danger too. Still, I needed answers. Henry, how well do you know Margaret? He frowned. Well enough to know she's careful with what she says. Why? Because I think someone's been keeping tabs on me, I said. And I'm not sure it's just Daniel. Henry's eyes narrowed. Then stop waiting for them to make a move. Find out who's behind it. The words lodged in my chest. He was right. Fear was exactly what they wanted. That night, instead of locking myself in my room, I sat by the window in the dark, watching the street. At 11:30, a figure appeared at the corner, tall, still, just beyond the reach of the street lamp. They stood there for a full minute before turning and walking away. It wasn't my imagination. I was being watched, and if I didn't act soon, the next move wouldn't be theirs. It would have to be mine. The following morning, I skipped the diner, skipped the market, and went straight to the library archives. If someone in Greyhaven was helping Daniel, I needed to know who and why. The dusty room smelled of old paper and salt air. I dug into public records, flipping through town council minutes from the past decade. Most of it was mundane, but then a name leapt out. Project Shoreline. My chest tightened. I'd seen that name before, on the documents I'd found in Daniel's office months ago. The council note said Shoreline had been a massive development proposal, rejected for environmental and economic concerns. But in the margins of one page, a handwritten note caught my eye. D. Collins, primary investor. I snapped a photo with my phone. Henry appeared in the doorway, a paper cup of coffee in hand. I figured I'd find you here, he said. Care to tell me why you're digging into a project that died a decade ago? I hesitated, then decided this was the moment to stop hiding. Because Daniel wasn't working alone back then, and I think some of those people are still here. Henry set the coffee down, leaning on the table. And you think they're watching you now? I know they are. He studied me for a moment, then said, then you have two choices, run or turn the tables. Something in his tone made my decision for me. I'm done running. That night, I left my curtains open for the first time since arriving. I wanted whoever was watching to see me sitting at my desk, calm and unafraid. My laptop was open to the Shoreline notes, pages scattered like a quiet challenge. At midnight, I saw movement again, the same figure, standing in the same place as before. But this time, I didn't look away. I stood, walked to the window, and met their gaze across the dark street. They froze, then slowly stepped back into the shadows. It wasn't much, but it was enough. They knew I wasn't the same scared woman who'd hidden in her room. The next time they came for me, I'd be ready, and I wouldn't be alone. The day after I stared down the shadow in the street, Henry showed up at the bookstore early. He had a manila envelope under his arm. You were right, he said, locking the door behind him. Some of the Shoreline people never left. And one of them is closer than you think. He spread the contents on the counter, old meeting minutes, investor lists, and grainy photographs from council hearings. My eyes scanned the names until one made my stomach drop. Margaret. Her name was printed neatly under Local Investor Liaison. The date was from 10 years ago, but there was no mistaking it. I shook my head. No, she's been helping me since I got here. Henry's voice was steady. Or she's been keeping you where she can see you. It all started clicking into place. Her constant visits, the way she always seemed to know when I'd been somewhere, the subtle questions about my past. I pulled my phone from my pocket and searched my camera roll. A photo from my first week in Greyhaven caught my eye. Margaret in the background at the harbor, looking directly at me. The envelope also held a photocopy of an old permit application. Next to Daniel's signature was hers. The permit was for preliminary environmental surveys, likely the first step in turning the coastline into a development site. Henry, this isn't just about Daniel. If Margaret's involved, she might be the one feeding him information about me. He nodded, which means if you want to keep that folder safe, you can't let her know what you're planning next. I glanced up the stairs to my room. The Shoreline folder was hidden there, but suddenly it didn't feel hidden enough. Henry must have read my mind. I've got a safe at home. You can stash it there until you're ready to use it. For a moment, I hesitated. Trust was a rare currency now. But if I kept the evidence here, Margaret could find it. I slid the folder from under the counter and handed it to him. If she asks, tell her I left town for a few days. Henry gave a grim smile. Let her wonder. As he left with the folder, I felt a strange mix of relief and dread. If Margaret really was working with Daniel, she'd know soon that I was no longer in her control, and that made me more dangerous than ever. That evening, I returned to the bookstore just as the sun was dipping behind the harbor. The sky was streaked with orange and violet, but the beauty of it barely registered. My mind was on Margaret. She was waiting for me at the bottom of the stairs, a paper bag of groceries in her hands. Claire, she said with a warm smile, I haven't seen you all day. Where have you been? I forced my expression into something neutral. Just needed to clear my head. Her eyes flicked briefly toward the counter where the Shoreline folder usually sat. Busy day? I shrugged. Nothing worth mentioning. For a heartbeat, the air between us felt heavier. She shifted the groceries in her arms, her smile still in place but not reaching her eyes. Well, I made that stew you liked. I'll bring some up later. I thanked her and slipped upstairs. But instead of staying in my room, I stood just inside the door, listening. Moments later, I heard the faint creak of the floorboards below, Margaret moving through the shop. The sound stopped near the counter, then resumed toward the stairs. She knocked lightly. "I'll leave your dinner outside," she said, her tone even. When I finally opened the door, the stew was there, steaming, but on top of the covered bowl was a small note in looping handwriting. "You can't trust everyone you think you can." The paper trembled in my hand. Was it a warning from her, or a threat? I didn't eat the stew. Instead, I poured it down the sink and sat at the window, watching the street for hours. Just after midnight, a figure appeared under the street lamp again. This time, they didn't linger. They looked up toward my window, then turned sharply and walked away. I felt the pieces falling into place. Margaret's role in Shoreline, the silent figure at night, Daniel's sudden reappearance. It was all connected. And now that the folder was no longer in my possession, they'd have to change their approach. What they didn't know was that I'd already changed mine. The next move would be mine, and it wouldn't be subtle. The next morning, I woke before dawn. For weeks, I had let fear dictate my choices, keeping to shadows, avoiding eyes, speaking in whispers. That ended today. I pulled open the small wardrobe in my room and reached past the muted sweaters and jeans I'd been wearing since arriving in Greyhaven. From the bottom drawer, I pulled out a navy dress I hadn't worn since my old life. Simple, fitted, and unapologetically confident. I paired it with black boots and a tailored coat. When I caught my reflection in the mirror, I almost didn't recognize myself. My hair was down, my posture straight, my eyes steady. For the first time in months, I looked like someone who wasn't afraid to be seen. Downstairs, Henry raised an eyebrow. "Big day?" "Something like that," I said, sliding my phone into my bag. Inside was a small flash drive containing the scanned Shoreline documents. I had already arranged a meeting with Laura, moved up from the original plan. We'd meet in a town 2 hours away, far from Daniel's reach. Before leaving, I made a point of walking through the market square. Conversations paused as I passed. I met every curious stare with a calm, deliberate nod. Let them see me. Let them wonder. Near the harbor, I spotted Margaret talking to one of the fishermen. She saw me and froze for a fraction of a second before offering her usual warm smile. I didn't break stride. By the time I reached the edge of town, the morning sun was cutting through the mist, turning the water gold. My ride, a trusted driver arranged by Henry, was waiting. But just as I reached for the car door, a familiar voice stopped me. "Going somewhere, Claire?" I turned to see Daniel leaning against a black SUV, hands in his pockets, that controlled, almost casual smile on his face. "Move," I said. He stepped closer. "You've been busy, making friends, collecting things that don't belong to you." I met his gaze. "If you mean the truth, it doesn't belong to you anymore." The smile faltered, just for a second. And in that moment, I knew I'd just shown him I wasn't the same woman he thought he could break. Daniel's hesitation lasted only a breath before he recovered that cool, condescending tone. "You're making a mistake, Claire. You have no idea who you're up against." I stepped closer until there were only a few feet between us. "No, Daniel. You have no idea who you're up against now." His eyes narrowed, but he didn't stop me when I got into the car. As we pulled away, I caught sight of him in the side mirror, still standing there, watching, calculating. The drive out of Greyhaven was quiet. My driver, an older man Henry trusted, didn't ask questions. We took winding back roads, avoiding the main highway. Halfway to the meeting point with Laura, my phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "You won't make it there." I showed it to the driver without a word. He frowned, took a sudden left turn, and sped up. "We'll take the old logging road," he said. "It'll add 20 minutes, but they won't expect it." By the time we reached the small cafe where Laura was waiting, my pulse was pounding. She stood as soon as she saw me, a notebook already open on the table. "You have it?" she asked. I handed her the flash drive. Everything, names, signatures, dates, enough to bury them. She plugged it into her laptop and began scanning the files, her eyes widening. This, Claire, this is huge. This isn't just fraud. This is conspiracy, environmental crime, bribery. I cut her off. Then make it loud, loud enough that they can't shut it down. She looked at me with something between admiration and caution. You know they'll come for you when this breaks. I'm counting on it, I said. But next time it'll be in the light where they can't hide. When I left the cafe, the winter air felt sharper, cleaner. I knew the moment the story hit, Daniel and his allies would scramble. But for the first time, I wasn't bracing for the blow. I was setting the terms. The next time I saw Daniel, it wouldn't be in a quiet street or a shadowed corner. It would be in front of everyone, and he'd have nowhere left to run. 3 days later, the opportunity came. Greyhaven's monthly council meeting was set to address new development proposals. Henry tipped me off that Daniel would be there, likely to smooth over the fallout before the Shoreline story broke. I arrived early, wearing the same navy dress and coat from the market square. I didn't slip quietly into the back row. I walked straight down the aisle to the front, every step deliberate. Heads turned, whispers rose. Daniel was leaning against the wall near the council table, chatting with the mayor. The moment he saw me, his smile froze. Before anyone could start the meeting, I stepped to the podium. Before we discuss new projects, I said, my voice carrying through the room, the people of this town deserve to know about an old one. Project Shoreline. Murmurs broke out. Daniel's jaw tightened. I reached into my bag and pulled out printed copies of the key documents from the flash drive Laura now had in safekeeping. These papers show a coordinated effort, fraud, bribery, and environmental destruction, led by Daniel Collins and supported by several members of this very council. Gasps, shouts, chairs scraping. One councilman stood, protesting, but I spoke over him. This isn't rumor. This is proof. And before you try to bury it, I held up my phone. It's already been sent to the state attorney's office, to environmental agencies, and to the press. The doors opened at the back. Laura entered with a small camera crew. The red recording light blinked like a warning. Daniel's control slipped. You think you can humiliate me here? In my town? I stepped away from the podium, facing him fully. It's not your town anymore. The cameras caught his glare, the tension in his posture. Around us, the council was in chaos, some shouting denials, others already on their phones. And in that swirl of voices, I realized I'd done it. I'd pulled them into the light, and there was no way back into the shadows. The council chamber erupted. Reporters shoved microphones forward, townspeople shouted questions, and the camera crew's light cast everything in a harsh, unflinching glare. Daniel tried to push toward me, but 2 officers, ones who'd clearly been tipped off, stepped between us. The police chief's face was unreadable, but his presence alone told me this had gone beyond Greyhaven's control. Laura moved quickly, firing questions at Daniel. Mr. Collins, are you denying your signature is on these contracts? Are you denying the offshore accounts in your name? He kept repeating, no comment, but his voice had lost its polish. He looked like a man who had just realized the walls were closing in. Outside, the commotion spilled onto the steps of the town hall. People held up phones, live streaming. Some of the same fishermen and shopkeepers who once avoided my eyes now stared at Daniel with open disgust. I walked past him without hesitation. He turned his head toward me, his voice low enough that only I could hear. You think you've won? I stopped just long enough to meet his gaze. No, I know I have. The cameras caught the moment, my steady eyes, his faltering mask. It would play on the evening news, freeze-framed as the image of his fall. Laura caught up to me at the bottom of the steps. That was the kill shot, she said, her breathless grin belying the chaos behind us. I glanced back at the council building, now buzzing with law enforcement, reporters, and a furious Daniel, being cornered with questions he couldn't answer. It struck me then, this wasn't just revenge. This was justice. Not the quiet kind that happens behind closed doors, but the loud kind that makes the powerful squirm under the weight of their own lies. And it was only just beginning, because from this moment on, Daniel Collins would live every day knowing he'd lost to the woman he thought he could break. 2 weeks later, Greyhaven felt different. The town was quieter, but not in the same way as when I'd first arrived. This was the hush that comes after a storm, when the damage is still being counted, but the air feels cleaner somehow. The shoreline story had exploded. Laura's article went statewide, then national. Investigations were underway. Several council members had resigned. Daniel's company stock plummeted. Vanessa vanished from the public eye. I hadn't spoken to Daniel since that day at the town hall. The only communication was through my lawyer, who was now handling the divorce and ensuring my share of our assets was protected. It wasn't about the money anymore. It was about reclaiming my life. Margaret never returned to the bookstore. I later learned she'd left town abruptly, her house sold to an out-of-state buyer. I didn't know if she'd run from the scandal or from me. Maybe both. Henry, on the other hand, had become something like family. We didn't talk much about the danger anymore, but I knew he'd been keeping an eye out for me. Sometimes we'd sit in the shop after closing, the scent of salt air drifting in through the open window, and he'd simply say, "You did what needed to be done." My baby was growing stronger. The doctor in the next town over said both of us were healthy, and for the first time in a long time, I believed it. I'd started walking along the cliffs again. Not out of fear, but because I loved the way the wind whipped through my hair and the sea stretched endlessly before me. One afternoon, I found myself back at the lighthouse. I climbed to the top and looked out over Greyhaven. From up there, the town didn't look like a place of secrets and betrayals. It looked like a place worth protecting. And maybe that was the lesson. You can't always choose what happens to you, betrayal, loss, danger, but you can choose what you do next. You can let it break you, or you can use it to build something stronger. I wasn't the same woman who'd run from the gala, clutching her stomach and her pride. That woman had been scared to raise her voice. This woman had taken on Daniel Collins and walked away standing. The ocean below roared, steady and unyielding. I smiled, feeling the baby shift inside me, and whispered, "We're going to be okay." Because if there's one thing I've learned, it's that strength isn't about never falling. It's about getting back up, louder and stronger than before. The weeks rolled on, and the ripples from that day in the town hall kept spreading. Greyhaven was still mending, but the conversations in the diner and along the harbor had shifted. People spoke more openly, questioned more boldly. The fear that had once kept the town silent was cracking. Some of the fishermen I'd seen unloading their nets in the early mornings now stopped to greet me by name. The cashier at the grocery store no longer looked at me with suspicion, but with something closer to respect. Even the mayor's assistant, once on the shoreline list, thanked me quietly outside the post office, saying, "You gave people here a reason to stand up again." I was finding my own new rhythm. I still lived above the bookstore, still worked alongside Henry, but now my days felt like they belonged to me. No more checking over my shoulder. No more wondering if every stranger was watching for Daniel. One morning, Laura called. Her voice was full of energy. "The state attorney's office is opening a formal case against Daniel and several of the shoreline investors. It's going to trial, Claire. Your testimony could be the final nail." I hesitated only for a second before saying, "Tell them I'll be there." It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about making sure no one else would go through what I had. Not the public betrayal, not the manipulation, not the feeling of being hunted in your own life. Daniel had once told me I was nothing without him. Now the truth was clear. I was more without him than I had ever been with him. The day I signed the final divorce papers, I walked to the cliffs and let the wind carry away the last of the weight I'd been holding. The ocean was wild that afternoon, waves crashing so hard the spray reached my face. I closed my eyes and breathed it in. I thought about the life ahead, raising my child in a place where truth mattered, where I could be myself without fear. There would be challenges, of course, but I had faced worse and survived. When I opened my eyes, I saw Henry at the edge of the path, hands in his coat pockets, watching me with a small nod. No words needed. He knew. I turned back to the sea and smiled. "We're free," I whispered. And I meant it. Not just from Daniel, but from the version of myself who thought silence was strength and survival meant staying small. Because sometimes the only way to protect your life is to set it on fire, and trust that what rises from the ashes will be stronger than anything that tried to break you.
And that wraps up today's story. Now we want to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments, and let's see how far these stories reach. If this story moved you or gave you chills, give it a like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories. One last thing, rate the story from 1 to 10 in the comments. Your feedback helps us bring you even better ones next time. Thanks for watching. We appreciate you being part of this storytelling journey.